The Nuclear Posture Review is a document required by the U.S. Congress where the Secretary of Defense sends to the Congress the administration's overall view of nuclear weapons, the role that nuclear weapons play in U.S. national security policy, what they want to communicate to allies that we try to reassure with these weapons, and how they communicate to potential adversaries of the United States what the deterrent strategy of the U.S. is. From that document then comes instructions which the military then used to actually design the targeting options for nuclear weapons and the planning of the U.S. nuclear force posture. The posture review also, in a sense, sets out the overall requirements for nuclear weapons, which then has implications in the budgets of the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense. It has implications for the size of the infrastructure necessary to produce and maintain U.S. nuclear weapons. So it's your basic kind of operating system for nuclear weapons. The new posture review departs from the one that the Bush administration did early in its term in several ways. One, the Obama one says that the primary objective or concern of U.S. nuclear posture is to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons to other states and to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by terrorists. This is interesting because past administrations have said these are very important things, but it's not part of our nuclear policy and our nuclear posture. The administration also says that very clearly that the goal of the United States is ultimately to have a world without nuclear weapons. It acknowledges we're far from that possibility today, but that it is an objective, and therefore that the U.S. will try to lead the world in reducing the role of nuclear weapons in everyone's national security policy. So the U.S. would try to lead by example and as much as possible to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons in U.S. security, but also to then encourage and put pressure on others to do the same. So those are two kind of interesting changes in priority, in a sense, of this posture. I think actually the Bush administration got an unfair criticism. People around the world didn't like the administration for a lot of reasons. And they basically interpreted the Bush administration strategy as somehow increasing the reliance by the U.S. on nuclear weapons and kind of lowering the threshold that would decide whether the U.S. would use nuclear weapons. Neither of those was true. The Bush administration also sought to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And I would argue that the Obama posture review extends what was already a process begun by the Bush administration, and it extends it in ways reflecting the realities of the world. The U.S. has greater conventional, non-nuclear military capabilities. It's fought a couple of wars since the last posture review in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are major wars, cost more than $1 trillion, and it's obvious to everyone that we would never use nuclear weapons in these situations. They're irrelevant, basically. And we have lots of other needs that need to be concentrated upon and fulfilled. And so I think this posture review reflects what the military understands, which is that it's almost impossible to imagine a circumstance other than a nuclear attack by a major state against the United States where the U.S. would threaten to use nuclear weapons. And so we ought to have a policy that reflects that reality. If you ask, okay, how would the U.S. interpret it if a competitor of the U.S. makes declarations about its nuclear posture? Let's say Russia, for example. And if the Russians came out and said, Americans, trust us. We won't use nuclear weapons against you. Period. Do you think the U.S. government and Congress and the military is just going to take that at face value and say, well, the Russians said they won't use nuclear weapons against us, therefore let's forget about the thousands of nuclear weapons that they have? No, you want to look at what their capabilities are, you want to look at scenarios, you want to be real. Similarly, what the U.S. actually says in terms of when it, whether or not it's beating its chest and saying to the world out there, don't you dare do anything to us or we'll nuke you, that they would take that seriously and as gospel and everything else it strains credulity. But similarly, if we said to our potential adversaries, don't worry, we're past nuclear weapons. We still got a couple thousand of them, but don't worry, we're nice guys. They won't believe that either. What they're looking at is what you got, what capability you have, the scenarios that they can imagine of conflict. And the basic reality is if the United States were threatened, and in a fundamental way, its existence were threatened, an extreme threat, or one of its allies like Japan were threatened that way, the other guy knows that if we have nuclear weapons and that's the only thing we can use to defeat the other guy, that's what we're going to do. And so it doesn't matter so much what we say about it, it's that capability and that context that will determine whether a state's deterred or not. This posture view, it states in many places that that is the goal of the United States, to move towards a world without nuclear weapons. It's not unilateral. The U.S. isn't going to get rid of its nuclear weapons alone. And it states clearly that as long as others have nuclear weapons, the U.S. will have to retain them, and will retain them in a safe and reliable manner. But it does commit to this goal and says, look, if others want to work with us, we're prepared to go there. And so it very specifically, for example, invites Russia and China, the two main potential competitors of the U.S. in the nuclear sphere. It invites them to further strategic dialogue, to further develop common understanding so we can avoid any offensive nuclear competition, but actually move to reduce the role of these weapons in each of our cases, and to make sure that we have stable relations so that we don't get into a crisis with China, for example, and have a misunderstanding which could lead to a nuclear war or the threat of a nuclear war. So that's very important in the posture, the invitation to Russia and China to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. I actually don't think it's going to be controversial. There may be people on the far right who don't like it, and in many cases, the comments I've read this morning from people from the far right, I think they don't understand reality, whether it was under the Bush administration or any previous administration. If you don't understand the reality that since 1945 we haven't used nuclear weapons, no one has used nuclear weapons in anger, that every president has understood that this is a taboo that they don't want to cross, and that we don't make nuclear threats idly. You have to understand that. Many people don't. You also have to understand that the U.S. military doesn't want to use nuclear weapons, doesn't feel like it would need to use nuclear weapons, and that we have way enough conventional military capability to deter any rational actor from threatening us, that the statements that are made now in this posture don't really change all of that. There's some reassurance to adversaries, but it's not the U.S. unilaterally giving up military power. On the left, it will be criticized because the president doesn't go far enough, they will argue, to say that the only purpose for U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. So the posture view says, look, we want to move to that point of saying the only way in which we would consider using nuclear weapons is to retaliate to a nuclear attack. But states may develop biological weapon capabilities in the future, and so we may then face a massive threat that's non-nuclear, and so we would reserve this option. And more importantly, today, we have some allies that we care greatly about, including South Korea prominently, who worry that they face an adversary, in this case North Korea, that could threaten them with massive artillery attacks because the distance between Seoul and North Korea is very slight. And that our ally South Korea might want us to still threaten North Korea with a nuclear response, even though North Korea would be attacking South Korea conventionally. The U.S. military knows that we can defeat North Korea without nuclear weapons. But in order to reassure our ally South Korea, we're not saying it quite that way. We're leaving the options fuzzier because this is reassuring to our ally in South Korea. Some of them might be, because people wanted Obama to have a posture and declare that the only purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter use of nuclear weapons by others. But I think it's very important to realize that this is the best posture review that the President and his administration thought could get 67 votes in the U.S. Senate to ratify the START Treaty. So on the one hand, you could have a posture review which says lovely things opposed to nuclear weapons that the disarmament community would applaud, but would in turn reduce the chances you could actually get a real treaty to reduce nuclear weapons ratified in the Senate. And so the administration decided to have a posture review that is aimed at or conceived in terms of what do we need to do to get votes in the Senate to actually implement reductions that could lead towards the future disarmament advocates might want, even if our language now may disappoint them. The NPR is very important. It's a document that will guide U.S. policy for at least the next 5 years. The new START Treaty, which will be signed in Prague on April 8th and hopefully ratified this year, it was already informed by the Nuclear Posture Review. In other words, when the Nuclear Posture Review was being drafted, the negotiators of the START Treaty and the Pentagon and the military got together and said, here's the basic parameters of what we're going to talk about in START. In the Nuclear Posture Review that you're doing, do you have any problem with us reducing to these levels? And the answer was no, that's easy. We can maintain deterrence. The security of the United States is ensured at the levels that we're talking about with START. So in a way, the Posture Review came before the START Treaty, even though it's being announced only 2 days before the signing of the treaty. Politically, what all this means is that the President's agenda that he announced a year ago in Prague of reducing the role of nuclear weapons now has the Posture Review, which does that, the START Treaty coming several days later, which demonstrates it, a nuclear security summit in Washington with the heads of more than 40 countries on April 12th and 13th, showing a commitment to try to keep nuclear materials from terrorists. That's the focus of the Nuclear Security Summit, all of which is meant to give momentum and show the seriousness of the U.S. as a conference happens in May in New York of all the states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the U.S. is trying to say, look, let's keep the bargain where all the rest of the world agrees not to get nuclear weapons and to work with us to keep nuclear weapons from terrorists and other states, because we're keeping our side of the bargain. We are doing everything we can to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and reduce the number of nuclear weapons. We're demonstrating that in April. You respond in kind in May as part of the package here. The NPR isn't directed against Iran in any way. If you ask the U.S. military, we don't need nuclear weapons to fight or deter Iran from committing the kind of aggression that militaries prevent. And even if Iran had a handful of nuclear weapons, the U.S., for the next decade at least, is going to have thousands of strategic nuclear weapons as well as hundreds of shorter-range nuclear weapons. So there is no nuclear equation with Iran, and the military knows that, even if people in the public or Congress kind of say, well, oh my God, we may need to nuke Iran. That's just not the way the military thinks about it. What the Posture Review can help do, though, is help encourage other countries to work with us to isolate Iran diplomatically, politically, and economically, with an understanding that the U.S. is trying to be progressive or constructive in the way the rest of the world thinks about nuclear weapons. And therefore, we strengthen our persuasiveness in getting the rest of the world to be constructive with us as we deal with the kind of threats that Iran poses.